Hello everyone and welcome back to Martini Mondays, except we're 2 days late, so it's going to be Whiskey Wednesday today. And Tony is going to make his favourite cocktail.
Yeah, since last week you began the series with your favorite cocktail, which is a Hendrick's Martini, I thought I would do my first one with my favorite, my go-to, which is an old-fashioned. So we're going to begin with a mixing glass filled with ice. And then, of course, the base for any old-fashioned is going to be a whiskey, either a bourbon or a rye whiskey. And I prefer rye because it's a little bit less sweet than a bourbon. But if you've heard anything about old-fashions being a drink where you begin by muddling an orange and a cherry in a glass, forget everything you've learned about that. That's something that came about after Prohibition when all this knowledge was lost, and it just really masks everything good about the whiskey. So we're going to begin with 2 parts whiskey, and I usually do about 1/3 part simple syrup. Some people do as much as half of a part, but that's a little bit sweeter than what I like, so we'll do about 1/3 part. And then the last ingredient are bitters, and bitters are really the essential part of an old-fashioned. You can really be economical with your whiskey, but bitters is where you want to invest a little bit because even though it's the lowest volume in the drink, it makes the most difference because they're very concentrated. I use these orange bitters from Bergen Haups, and I use them in an eyedropper vial because you can control the portions a little bit more.
So niche and curated today. Okay.
So that's about, so what I'm doing is about the equivalent of 3 dashes per drink of this orange bitters, and it's about 8 drops per dash. So at the moment I'm just estimating, but otherwise I would be very specific. And then about 2 dashes of these cinnamon bitters.
Oh, nice.
So the orange bitters will brighten things up a little bit, and the cinnamon will bring a little bit of the earthiness in the whiskey out. So equivalent of about 2 dashes per drink, which is about 16 drops each. And that's pretty close. And then we're going to stir with this bar spoon for about 30 seconds.
It's very important that you stir and don't shake, isn't it, for an old-fashioned? You always get that kind of scummy brown.
Right. Well, I would say that anything without an egg white or without citrus in it, or dairy, I would stir and not shake. But that's kind of a matter of taste. But for an old-fashioned, definitely. And sufficient stirring it's more than just mixing the drink. It's more than just cooling it down. It's also the dilution that comes from melting the ice. And that water is going to open up some of the flavors in the cocktail.
Sounds good.
So, we have it. We'll use a strainer and strain over fresh ice in a highball. And then for our garnish, just an orange peel, just a little squeeze to express it, as they say. And there you have it, Maestro. Cheers, and may I also say, looking forward to this Friday, happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers. So I thought today would be a good chance to talk about one of your favorite living and active composers, Thomas Adès, who you basically introduced me to, and I've really come to enjoy and appreciate. So how did you first come to know Tom's music, and how did you first come to know Tom?
I knew his music first. I knew his music from when I was 15, and my high school music teacher told me to go and buy a CD of his.
And he is also British, right?
Yes, yeah. So there was a CD that has his piece Asila, and basically all the music up till then. That was in 1998 or 2000, that kind of time. And I completely fell in love with this one piece, Asila, which we played here with Beethoven 9 4 years ago. Remember, it was because it was the day that I bought this house, and we did a Sila and Beethoven 9.
Yeah.
A Sila is the plural of asylum, so it's places of refuge, and it's got a very famous movement, which is like you're outside a club, and you can hear two different kinds of music.
Yeah, the third movement.
Coming together. Yeah. But it also encapsulates a lot of the themes that I love in Tom's music, which is that there's always this sense of there's always this sense of
that's what Alfie thinks about it.
There's always this sense of ambiguity, of something not quite fitting together, of something terrible happening in a room next door. And I find that gives his music a great deal of reality and a sense of being of our time.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. He's a composer that works in several different genres, and a lot of composers throughout history have not successfully navigated everything from the symphonic to the concerto to the vocal rep, but Tom really does. What are some of the other pieces outside of the symphonic repertoire that you have found particularly impactful?
Well, there are 3 operas. Powder Her Face, from when he was very young, which is a story about a duchess who's run out of money. Was a very beautiful society lady, and everything's gone wrong for her.
Yeah.
Then also the second opera, The Tempest, which I was at the first performance of back in 2004 at the Royal Opera House, an adaptation of Shakespeare's play.
Yeah.
A really incredibly moving and powerful.
It is incredibly moving.
Some of you might have seen it on the Met free broadcast a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And then his third opera is based on a Louis Buñuel movie called The Exterminating Angel, which is about guests who discover they can't leave a dinner party for some strange psychological reason. Nobody can go through the door.
Right.
And they remain there for weeks, and everything deteriorates. And I was his assistant on the first production of that in Salzburg, so I spent a whole summer with that opera.
Yeah.
So all the operas are wonderful in their own ways. But you're right, he has a very comprehensive range of music. There's lots of chamber music, there are orchestral works, and also opera. You asked how I got to know him. When I was a Dudamel Fellow with the LA Phil, I was sitting one day in the Hollywood Bowl waiting for a concert to begin, and I was in the special seats for orchestra people, and he came and sat down beside me, and my eyes nearly popped out of my head because I've been a fan for 15 years at that point. And I said, "Are you Thomas Adès?" He said, "Yes." I didn't know that he had a house in Hollywood as well, and that he is very joined
When
up.
did he move to the States?
He still lives in London, but has a place in Hollywood.
Oh,
as
okay.
well. And so we both went to the same university. We had the same teachers in some points. We have loads of friends in common. So it was there was lots to talk about.
Hit it off.
But I think that glitz of Hollywood is quite an important part of his music sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons why so many people like his music is that people who maybe don't know a lot of other contemporary music can relate to it. It has an extremely approachable, sometimes glitzy quality. And I'm thinking particularly of the Piano Concerto, which is a piece I know you like a lot.
Very much. Which premiered just about a year or so ago.
That's right.
With Boston Symphony.
Yep, and Kirill Gerstein.
Yeah.
And I was at the premiere of that as well, and that was incredible because it was, in some ways, the most approachable music that I've ever heard him write.
Yeah.
You can hear the references to other music too.
Plenty.
Particularly Gershwin in the first movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very, he's a modernist, but he's also quite romantic. It's music about...
There's loads of Rachmaninoff and Liszt in that concerto as well.
Mm-hmm. It's music that's about human expression, and I think that's what I like so much about it.
So what do you think in terms of expression, and maybe you even mean that with a capital E, but what do you think is particularly timely for our time about his music?
Yeah. Well, I think that the greatest music of any period of time encapsulates the values of that period. So if you listen to Mozart, you can see how Mozart sounds like Rococo architecture.
Yeah.
If you listen to Beethoven,
symmetry.
yeah, and the detail and the sense of balance,
Right.
the sense of trying to please the audience, of things being pleasurable but not excessively romantic and poised. Or you think of Beethoven and you very much have revolutionary music. You have music that's from the time of Napoleon.
Heroicism.
Yeah, heroicism.
The individual.
Yeah, the artist as a kind of hero.
Yeah.
In Tom's music, I feel the isolation of the individual in the modern world. That kind of sense of dislocation that we all have now from, of alienation from each other. Although I don't want to say that word because it's got such Adorno overtones, and that's not what I mean at all.
Right.
But many people live their lives today with much more ambiguity and uncertainty about important things than in the past, be that their spiritual set of values or simply the way one experiences society if you're living in a huge big city and you're constantly surrounded by people but can still be lonely. A lot of that comes through in the music, and particularly one piece that I think is his greatest work of all, which is a piece called Tevot. Tevot is the Hebrew word for ark, like Noah's Ark. And this is a piece, again like a Sila, a piece about a kind of vessel that takes you somewhere, an ark that takes you from one place to another. And so if the piece is a kind of metaphor of a journey, there's a section in the middle of the piece, the harmony is sinking as often it does in Tom's music. And you feel like you're about to go down the plug hole. There's a very dark quality. I mean, Tom told me once that Simon Rattle told him that there's always a part of every one of his pieces where the shit hits the fan.
Yeah.
And that point in Tevot is absolutely terrifying. And I find that sense of the individual being thrown around by the tempest of 21st century life to be a very powerful part of his music. There's also, of course, a yearning for simpler times. I mean, the second movement of the piano concerto is incredibly bold in just how unabashedly romantic it is. So it's not just music that's a reflection of today. It's also a place of solace.
Well, you know him and his music very well, but this just goes to speak about how wonderful a completed work of art is, because I always took that to be sort of a tongue-in-cheek look at looking backwards, as it's nostalgic, but it's impossible and it's gone, because the third movement then brings us back into a different place. And but it's interesting that you take it that way. I
think what's also important is that so much music that we hear today sounds like music from the past.
Yeah. And
I don't think that's a good thing all the time. If you want to be inspired by the past, be inspired by it, but make it new. And when you listen to Tom's music, you're aware of the whole canon of music, but it never sounds like those people. It sounds like him, because he's a modernist and he makes it new. And I think that's what, it's very Stravinskian in that kind of way, of looking at the past but making it new.
Right.
And I think that's very different from neo-romanticism, which we have so much of now, and which I don't identify with as strongly.
Yeah. And, an argument can be made that is not going to be art that, given a lot of separation, will endure in the canon, because if it's going to sound just like something else, then how is it going to find its place? Given a little bit of time separation.
So I would definitely recommend everybody listen to Tevot. We were supposed to be playing it at the end of the season. Tevot, The Tempest, Asila, Powder of Face, The Exterminating Angel, and the Piano Concerto, and those are all available on Spotify.
And I think the Piano Concerto is a very good first place if one has never listened to his music, just because of the accessibility of the sound world.
Yeah, I agree.
But that doesn't make any of the others any less wonderful. It's just a good place to start, because it's basically I Got Rhythm circa 2019.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So we're still eager to hear what you'd like to know about musically. Lots of you have written in about drinks, but we could have a few more suggestions about music. That would be great.
Yeah, some topics that you'd like to hear us talk about. Yeah, so, well, thank you again, and this is really great to hear you talk about him and his music, so
Cheers.
cheers.